My name is Naomi Reed. I am 29 years old, and that morning I was stopped at the entrance of the auditorium where my younger brother was about to be sworn in. I said my name. The receptionist checked the list twice and then said my name was not on it. A few hours after I left, Evan stood up abruptly in the middle of the crowd, his face drained of color, when he opened an envelope I had left behind. If you have ever been pushed out of your own family, leave a comment saying where you are listening from and how you once chose silence. I grew up in Houston in a house that was clean and quiet like a showroom. My father liked everything in the right place at the right time. My mother liked everything to look nice, and Evan liked winning. Even as a child, he knew how to make adults smile. He said the right thing at the right moment, and never forgot to look people straight in the eye, while I learned how to stand at the edge of the frame so the family photo would look balanced. In my memory, dinner usually started with my father asking Evan what he did well that day, then my mother adding what he needed for the coming week, and I was asked last, "Naomi, are you okay?" I nodded, and that was it. I really was okay in the way a child becomes okay when they are used to seeing attention as something meant for other people. If I stayed quiet, dinner went by faster, and if dinner went by faster, no one got irritated over small things. When I was 10, I believed birthdays could change the rules in our house. I counted the days on the calendar. I imagined a cake with my name written in frosting, and a moment when everyone would have to look at me instead of Evan. That morning I woke up early. I put on a blue dress. I went downstairs. My mother was on the phone talking about Evan's schedule for extra classes. I stood in front of her and said, "Today is my birthday." She covered the receiver and said, "Yes, I will figure it out later." Then she went back to the call as if I had reminded her to turn off the stove. I waited until noon and then until afternoon. I made myself a sandwich. I heard cars outside and thought maybe my father would come home early, but it was just Evan coming back with a heavy backpack and a confident smile. He asked where we were going to eat tonight. My mother said she would see what my father texted. Evan turned to me and asked if I had finished my homework, and then went upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen, and that hollow feeling was like being left off a list. That night, after I showered and sat on my bed reading, there was a soft knock on the door. I thought my mother had remembered, but the one who came in was Irene, my father's mother. She wore a light coat with a faint perfume, and in her hands was a small gift, wrapped in wrinkled but careful paper. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at me like she was looking at a real person. She said, "Happy birthday to my little girl," and placed the box in my hands. Inside was a small silver pocket recorder, old but solid. She said she used it when she worked as a secretary. She said, "You have a very sharp ear. You hear things other people miss." She gently touched my cheek and said, "Keep it, and record the things you want to remember, because one day people will tell you that you imagined it all, but you did not imagine it." At that moment, I only felt warm, because for the first time someone gave me a gift as if I deserved it. From the day I had the recorder, I began recording the smallest things. I recorded the sound of rain. I recorded my mother laughing with outsiders. I recorded my father sighing when Evan talked about school. I recorded my own voice reading a passage and laughed because my voice sounded unfamiliar. I did not tell anyone about it. I kept it in a drawer like a shelter, and from then on I cried less because I had a place to put the things I did not say. As time passed, Evan was given more priority as he grew, and I was praised more for being independent as I grew. That praise felt like a waiver. It allowed them not to ask if I was tired or lonely. I learned to nod, learned not to ask, and learned to smile at the right time when outsiders praised how happy my family was. Then came the day I stood at the auditorium door and heard the words, "Your name is not on the list." I was not surprised. I only felt a small lock inside my chest click into place, as if everything finally acknowledged what I had known for a long time. And I also knew the envelope I left would force them to look at me once. I stepped back from the reception desk. I did not argue or call anyone. I simply said thank you and walked straight to the gift table in the hallway where envelopes and boxes were stacked. I placed my envelope under the white ribbon and wrote Evan's name in steady handwriting. I turned away and booked a flight back to California immediately. I began to understand my place in the family, not from blunt words but from very small details that outsiders never see, like how my father always checked Evan's backpack before leaving while I remembered or forgot on my own. Like how my mother remembered Evan's exam dates exactly, but had to ask me which grade I was in when acquaintances casually asked. I did not blame them because they never said I was unimportant, they simply acted as if I did not need attention. At school I did well. Not outstanding enough to make the class gasp, but well enough that teachers were not worried. Whenever I received a certificate, I kept it in my bag for a few days before giving it to my mother. She glanced at it and put it on top of the refrigerator for a while, before it was covered by Evan. New tutoring schedule. I realized my achievements were like decorations, nice to have, and no one noticed if they disappeared. The only one who noticed the imbalance was Irene. She did not speak badly of my parents. She did not loudly defend me. She simply observed and remembered, the way she taught me to remember. Whenever she visited, she always looked for me first, asked me what I heard that day. I told her small things. She listened attentively, as if it were the most important news of the day. Then she asked Evan afterward. The difference was subtle, but I felt it. It was the feeling of being seen. When I was 13, Evan started joining youth leadership programs. My parents took him everywhere, and I often stayed home with Irene. She taught me how to organize documents, how to keep receipts, how to read the fine print at the bottom of utility contracts. She said life is not only what people show in front, it also lives in the words people skip. If you do not read them, they will decide for you. I did not understand everything, but I remembered. Once I asked her why she always kept copies of everything. She smiled and said, "Because human memory is very selective. When you need it most, it betrays you." During those afternoons, I sat at the dining table listening to her stories from her youth, stories of being dismissed because she was a woman, stories of losing opportunities because no one believed her words. She was not bitter. She spoke like she was talking about the weather, but every story shared the same conclusion, that if you want respect, you need something concrete to put on the table, not feelings but facts. Meanwhile, Evan grew up surrounded by applause. He was used to adults believing him, used to being nodded at as long as he spoke with the right tone. I did not hate him, I only felt that we grew up in two different worlds under the same roof. When I entered high school, I joined a data research club because I liked how things were proven by numbers. My advisor told me I had a talent for spotting small anomalies others missed. I told my mother during dinner. She smiled and said, "As long as you are happy," then turned to ask Evan how practice went. I closed my mouth and kept eating. When I was 16, I was selected for a summer program in basic financial analysis. I needed a parent's signature to attend. My mother signed without reading carefully. My father did not ask more. They trusted that I could handle it myself. I realized that trust was both freedom and neglect. Irene was different. She read every line, asked me about each clause, taught me to ask back when I did not understand, and reminded me to keep a copy. That summer program was the first time I saw the power of data when it is arranged correctly. Change one small assumption and the entire conclusion can flip. I was drawn to the idea that truth does not always live in the loudest statement. When Evan graduated high school, the family threw a big party. Guests were everywhere. I helped carry things and heard people praise how Evan would go far. My mother beamed, my father raised a glass, and I thought about how I was about to leave this house to study far away. No one noticed me packing. Only Irene stood at my door and handed me a thin envelope. Inside was a small notebook. She said, "Write down what you see. Do not rush to conclude, just write, because one day you will need to look back at it differently." I took that notebook with me when I left Houston, along with a mix of relief and emptiness. I was not angry at my family. I only knew that if I wanted to exist on my own terms, I had to learn to stand without their gaze, and I did not expect that Irene quiet lessons would become the only thing protecting me when the truth began to surface many years later. Leaving Houston was the first decision in my life that did not require permission. I chose Seattle because there were no acquaintances, no memories, and no one expecting me to become a version they could be proud of. I brought 2 suitcases, the notebook Irene gave me, and the old recorder that had been silent for years but I never threw away. The first days in the new city were quiet. I studied. I worked part-time. I observed. And I realized I was comfortable in spaces where no one needed me to prove anything beyond doing my part correctly. I chose data analysis and compliance because answers there do not come from the loudest voice, but from what is recorded. I liked tracing patterns. Liked how everything eventually had to fit, and if it did not fit, it was not because I felt wrong but because something was hidden. I studied diligently, Not to stand out, but to be certain. Each term I kept my assignments, feedback, and emails with instructors. Irene's habit of keeping copies became a natural reflex. My family rarely called, and when they did, conversations usually revolved around Evan. My brother excelled, was referred to internships, was guided by mentors. Every time my mother told me, I said congratulations and stayed quiet, not out of jealousy, but because I knew there was no room for my story in that call. When I graduated, I sent a short message in the family group saying I was done. My father replied with a generic congratulations. My mother sent a clapping emoji. Evan messaged privately saying, "Keep going, sis, I know you will be fine." I read it and smiled, because that was the kind of care that fit the role they were used to assigning me. I started working at a small consulting firm that specialized in internal process audits. The pay was not high, but it was enough, and most importantly, I was learning. I learned to read reports, not to believe them but to question them. I learned to look at numbers that were too perfect, curves that were too smooth, and ask where they had been adjusted. The work was not glamorous. There were no photos for social media, but I felt myself moving forward little by little, like building a foundation no one could see. During those years, Irene would occasionally call and ask how my work was going. I would tell her. She would listen. She never praised me for being good. She only asked, "Did you keep the documents? Did you record the dates?" And every time I said yes, she would say, "Good, that is enough." Evan was different. He began appearing on local news, fundraising events, community programs. My mother sent me article links with proud messages. I opened them and saw my brother speaking very well, the right words, the right rhythm, always followed by applause. I did not doubt him. I only saw the distance between us growing wider, not emotionally, but in how we saw the world. Evan believed in a well-told story, and I believed in what sat beneath that story. There was a rare time Evan called me and asked if I could look over a report, just for reference, he said. I agreed because I thought it was normal. I reviewed it and noticed a few inconsistencies, not major errors, just small adjustments that benefited the final outcome. I pointed them out and said he should ask his team again. Evan laughed and said I was always too meticulous, but he would look into it. I did not say more because I did not want to be difficult. After that call, Evan asked me for help less often, and I understood that my caution did not match his pace. Time passed. I changed companies, moved into a higher role, took responsibility for reviewing larger projects, and I began seeing familiar patterns, ways numbers were legitimized, reports made to look good rather than be honest. I did not expose anyone. I simply noted, kept records, and learned how to protect myself. When Irene passed away, I flew back to Houston for the funeral, stood in the back row watching my family receive guests. My mother looked tired but composed. My father was subdued. Evan was busy talking to influential people. I did not resent it. That was how he had been raised to survive. After the funeral, her lawyer asked me to stay. He handed me a thin file and said this was what Irene wanted me to keep, not to use immediately, but to understand. I opened it and saw her notes, copies, dates, and a short letter telling me not to rush, to wait for the right moment. I took the file back to Seattle, placed it in a drawer with the old notebook, and continued my life. I did not know when the right moment would be. I only knew that everything I had learned since childhood was leading toward it. When the news of Evan's upcoming swearing-in was announced, the family called each other excitedly. I heard it from my mother. She said it was a major milestone, the pride of the family. I congratulated her, asked about the schedule, and then no invitation came. I understood immediately. And this time I did not feel sad. I only felt clarity. I decided to fly to Houston, not to claim a seat, not to cause a scene, but to do one single thing. To return what had been prepared long ago, what Irene believed I would know how to use when needed, and in my head echoed what she once said, that truth does not need to be loud, it only needs to be placed correctly. I booked my flight 3 days before Evan's ceremony, told no one, posted nothing, sent nothing in the family group. I simply folded my clothes neatly, brought my laptop, Irene file, and the old recorder, whose batteries I had replaced long ago, even though I had never used it. On the flight, I did not listen to music. I looked out the window and thought about previous trips back to Houston, the times I stood at the edge of rooms, The times I was introduced as the older daughter working out of state, without any notable achievements attached. This time felt different, not confidence, not tension, but a very clear quiet, like when you know you are moving in the right direction and do not need further validation. I arrived in Houston at night, rented a small hotel room a few miles from downtown, close enough to move easily, far enough to avoid chance encounters. The next morning, I sat in a familiar coffee shop near City Hall, opened my laptop, and arranged everything one last time, not because I feared mistakes, but because I respected the truth and wanted it to appear in its clearest form. I reread Irene notes, each familiar slanted line, each underline, each question she posed without ever using an exclamation point. I understood why she chose me, not because I was smarter than Evan, but because I did not rush to conclusions before seeing enough. I checked the copies again, matched dates, verified signatures. Everything lay as it was, needing no edits, no additions. My phone buzzed. My mother texted that the family had arrived at the large hotel hosting the post-ceremony reception. She said it was a shame I could not make it back in time. I replied briefly that I was already back. She did not read it right away. Or perhaps she did but did not know how to respond. I did not blame her, because I knew that in her mind there was only one image now. Evan, in a tailored suit, standing before a crowd, speaking about responsibility and the future. I walked around the City Hall area at noon, watching crews set up the stage, test sound, hang banners, everything done carefully and smoothly, like the story of Evan that had long been prepared, leaving no room for unscripted questions. I stood there for a while, then returned to the hotel. Because I did not come to watch, I came to wait for the right moment. In the afternoon I received a call from Evan, his voice upbeat. He said, "Mom told me you are back. Why did you not tell me?" I said you were busy. I did not want to interrupt. Evan laughed and said we would meet after the ceremony. The family would have dinner together. I said okay, with no specific expectations, only noting that the invitation arrived when I no longer needed it. That evening, I turned on the recorder and checked it again. I did not plan to use it in a crowd. I just wanted it ready. A habit. The way Irene always advised, preparation was not to attack but to avoid being caught off guard. I went to sleep early, deeply, and without dreams, which surprised me, because every previous trip to Houston had left me restless. This one did not. The next morning the city was busier than usual. I wore something simple, not eye-catching, not overly formal. I did not need to appear as any kind of character. I only needed to be myself. I arrived at the ceremony area when most people were already seated. I stood in the back where unfamiliar faces usually gather. I looked at Evan from a distance. He looked confident, exactly as expected, and in that moment I felt no envy, only regret for him, because he did not know what he was standing on. When the ceremony ended and people moved toward the reception area, I did not follow the crowd. I waited a bit, then entered through a side entrance used by staff, spaces I was familiar with from my work, and no one asked who I was. Inside the reception room, laughter and conversation filled the air, glasses clinked, congratulations flowed. Evan stood at the center, my mother beside him, my father shaking hands. I watched from afar, and felt like I was seeing a familiar scene replayed. Except this time I knew I would not be there long. I walked to the gift table where envelopes and boxes were neatly arranged. I placed a thin envelope down. No company name, no logo, just Evan. From Naomi. My handwriting clear but unadorned. A woman nearby looked at me. I smiled. She smiled back. No one asked anything further, because no one believed a thin envelope could change anything. I turned and left immediately, exiting the reception before anyone noticed my presence, stepping outside, taking a long breath, and for the first time in many years I felt light, not because everything was finished, but because I had placed the truth where it belonged. The rest was no longer in my hands. I left the area as the sun was setting, walked a long distance before calling a ride, not to avoid anything but to give things time to begin moving on their own. My phone stayed silent for nearly an hour, which did not worry me, because I knew the envelope would not be opened right away. It needed the right moment, like most truths hidden too long. I returned to the hotel, showered, changed, sat by the window watching traffic crawl below, and thought of Irene. of how she used to say that if something is true, it will find its way out on its own, without being pushed. Just as I set my phone down, it began vibrating non-stop, not one call but many. Evan name, then my mother, then my father, then Evan again. The vibrations so rapid it felt like the room itself was tilting. I did not answer immediately. I read Evan's first message, just one short line. Where are you? What did you just leave? The tone was not panicked but confused, as if he were standing before a door not fully opened. I waited a few more minutes, then my phone buzzed again. This time my mother. She texted that there was something we needed to talk about. Her words hurried. No period at the end. I still did not reply, not out of anger, but because I knew this moment needed a little more time. I imagined Evan opening the envelope after cutting the cake, when people had drunk enough to lower their guard, when confidence was at its peak. I imagined his eyes as he read the first line, the slight slowing, like when someone realizes they missed something right in front of them. I was not there to see it, but I knew the feeling, because I had felt it when Irene gave me the file. The phone rang a third time. Evan called. I answered. His voice was neither high nor low, just slightly hoarse. He asked if we could talk. I said yes. He was silent for a few seconds, then asked, "How long have you known about this?" I asked about what. He said about the donations under the family foundation name routed through an intermediary account, about our father's signature on documents he once said did not exist. I did not answer immediately. I only said, read the appendix carefully. Read the handwritten notes too. He was quiet longer, then let out a long breath. He asked if I planned to do anything next. I said no. I only sent you what Irene left me. The rest is your decision. He laughed softly, not a happy sound. Said you are always like this. I did not respond, because I knew he was not blaming me. He was rearranging his world. The call ended quickly. No promises, no apologies. Just one final line. Do not leave Houston yet. I set the phone down, and it rang again. My mother, I answered. She asked, "What are you doing?" Her voice trembling despite trying to stay calm. I said I am not doing anything. I only gave Evan what belongs to him. She asked, "Do you know what that will do?" I said I know it will force everyone to tell the truth. She was silent, then asked, "Where are you?" I said at the hotel. She said your father wants to see you. Tonight, I said I cannot. Not tonight, she sighed and said, then tomorrow. I said we will see. After that call I realized I did not feel scared, and I did not feel relieved. I only felt a clarity spreading, like a light switching on in a room that had gotten used to darkness. I opened my laptop, not to work, just to reread an old email from Irene that I had read many times but had never felt was enough. In it, she wrote that, "Family is not a place without mistakes, it is a place where people dare to look straight at them." I smiled, because I finally understood why she did not hand that file to Evan directly. The night moved slowly. I did not sleep deeply, but I did not toss either. I woke a few times to street noise, and each time I saw my phone light up with new messages. Evan sent a few more lines asking about certain details. I replied briefly, precisely, without extra commentary. The next morning, I went down to the lobby, bought coffee, sat in a quiet corner, and for the first time since returning to Houston, I felt I was no longer the person standing at the edge of this story. I had stepped into it, not with my voice, but by putting the truth on the table and letting it do the rest. I met my parents at noon that day, not at home, but in a private room at the familiar restaurant where our family hosted people whenever something had to be said discreetly. I arrived 10 minutes early, sat at a table near the window, ordered a drink, watched people pass by, and reminded myself that this meeting was not to decide right or wrong, it was to see clearly what had existed for a long time. My parents came together, my mother walking faster, my father slower behind her, his face tight and closed, the exact expression I had seen whenever something slipped beyond his control. My mother sat down first and asked if I slept okay. I said fine. She nodded as if that answer gave her part of her breathing back. My father did not waste time. He asked where I got those documents, I said from Irene. He frowned and asked why she did not tell him. I said maybe because she knew he would not listen. The air thickened, My mother put her hand on the table and said enough, then turned to me and asked if I knew Evan had already called his own lawyer. I said yes. My mother sighed and said the family was being put in a very difficult position. I asked difficult for whom. She did not answer right away. My father said Evan was still young. His career was just starting. Things like this could ruin everything. I looked at him and said if it is that fragile that it cannot survive the truth, then maybe it was already broken before. He went quiet, eyes down on the table, then said I was always too rational, that I did not understand the feeling of a father. I said I understood the feeling of a child who is used to not being asked. My mother cried, silently, tears falling onto her hand. She said she truly did not know where those funds were routed. She said she trusted my father, and trusted Evan, and believed everything would be fine as long as no one touched it. I did not blame her. I said I knew, because I had believed that too for a long time. The conversation went on, no shouting, no clear accusations, only unfinished sentences, long stretches of silence, and the sense that a familiar structure was cracking right in front of us. Finally, my mother asked what I wanted. I said I did not want anything. I only wanted no one to have to live inside a pretend story anymore. My father looked at me for a long time, then asked what I planned to do next. I said I would go back to my city. My work was waiting. He nodded, did not stop me, did not hold me, but did not see me out either. When I stood up, my mother took my hand and said if things settle down I could come back. I said I am still here. I am just not standing still anymore. I left the restaurant and stepped into the harsh Houston noon sun. What I felt was not victory, and not loss, but a change that could not be reversed. That afternoon Evan called again, his voice tired but clear. He said I was right. There were things he had never asked because he feared the answers. He said his lawyer confirmed the records were real, with no discrepancies. He asked if I was willing to meet him. I said yes. We met at a small park near where he used to run when he was in school. No family, no one else. Evan said he felt like he had been pulled out of a dark room into light. Blinding but necessary. I said that feeling would pass. He asked if I was angry. I said no. He asked if I regretted it. I said no. He smiled and said I was always calmer than he thought. I said that was what I learned when I had to wait too long to be heard. When we parted, Evan said he needed time. I said I knew, and this time I was not in a hurry. I went back to the hotel, packed, booked my flight for the next morning, and as I closed my suitcase, I realized Houston did not feel heavy the way it used to. It felt like a chapter that was finished, not something to rewrite, not something to tear up, only something to close at the right time. After I left Houston, I did not return to my old life immediately. I went through a long, quiet phase. Like water that has been stirred needs time to go flat again. In Seattle, everything still moved as before. Work still needed me. Projects still came with deadlines. Emails still demanded clear responses. But inside me, a different rhythm was forming. I began to see that for years I had lived in a state of waiting. Waiting to be called by name. Waiting to be asked what I thought. Waiting for a moment when someone would turn back and say they had seen me all along. That moment finally arrived, but not in the way I once imagined. It came not as recognition, but as the collapse of a structure I had stood outside of for a long time. I did not feel joy about it, and I did not feel the pain I once thought I would. It felt like setting down a suitcase I had carried too long, and noticing my shoulder lighten before I even had time to think about it. Evan called me more often. Not to ask for quick advice, but to say out loud thoughts he had not yet organized. He told me that every meeting felt different now, that he no longer walked into rooms believing everyone would nod, that he had to learn to hear uncomfortable questions and accept not having an answer right away. I listened and did not correct him, did not steer him. I only asked questions that made him pause. I knew he was living through what I had lived with all my youth, the feeling of being forced to look back at yourself without any protective padding. My mother changed too. Her calls no longer revolved around how things would look to other people. She asked if I was sleeping well, asked if I was eating regular meals, simple questions that had rarely appeared before. Once she said she was cleaning the house and found my old things, notebooks, certificates, yellowed with age. She said she did not remember what she was thinking when she put them away. I said it was okay, because I had stopped waiting for her to remember. My father stayed quiet longer. He did not call, did not text, but sometimes sent short emails about very specific things, asking what a clause meant, asking where to start a process. I answered like I was answering someone who needed to understand, not someone who needed to be forgiven. I realized forgiveness was not something I was obligated to hand out immediately. It was something that would come only when everything had been still long enough that I no longer felt pulled back. At work, I started noticing the difference in how I showed up. I no longer tried to prove I was right. I simply presented the data and let it speak, and that earned trust in a more lasting way. A coworker told me I had a kind of calm people could not ignore. I laughed because it was the result of years of not being heard. I also began writing again. Not dry notes, but short lines for myself, about what had happened, not to judge, only to put it in order. In those lines, Irene appeared often, not as a hero, but as an anchor, the only person who never required me to become someone else in order to stand beside her. I realized she did not prepare me to take anyone down. She prepared me to stand straight when the truth passed through. Some nights I sat alone thinking about family, about Houston, about the kitchen where I once stood waiting for a birthday to be remembered, and I no longer felt the same sadness. That memory now felt like an old photograph. Still clear, but no longer able to hurt me. Evan sent me a draft of a new speech and asked what I thought. I read it and said it was more sincere, but also more dangerous. He asked, "Dangerous how?" I said dangerous because it would not allow him to go back to who he used to be. He went quiet, then said he accepted that. I ended the call and realized it was the first time he chose a path without an exit already built in. My mother sent me a long message saying she was learning not to interfere, that she realized love was not keeping everything intact at any cost. It was accepting change even when it scared her. I did not reply right away, not because I was unmoved, but because I needed her words to exist without me softening them. I also began setting clearer boundaries for myself. I did not join conversations that made me shrink. I did not over-explain when I was not asked. I allowed myself to leave spaces where I used to stay just to prove I could endure them. Those boundaries did not make me lonelier. They made me calmer. One afternoon, walking home in a light rain, I realized I no longer imagined the moment my family would fully understand me, and that did not disappoint me. It freed me. I understood some relationships do not need to be perfected to continue. They only need to be set at the right distance. I did not abandon my family, but I also did not stand in my old place. I chose a place where I could see them more clearly without losing myself. And in that quiet, I knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be days Evan wobbled, days my mother slipped back into old habits, days my father closed himself off, but I also knew that this time I would not disappear to keep everything looking fine. I would stay with myself, and that was the biggest change I had ever made. Everything did not end in a clear moment the way people often hope. There was no family meeting where someone stood up and apologized in front of everyone, no headline flipping the story overnight, no morning where I woke up and found every crack magically gone. Instead, there was a quiet process, slow and irreversible. I continued living in Seattle, continued my work, continued mornings making coffee in my small kitchen, continued evenings sitting by the window, watching city lights reflect on the glass. And within that rhythm I realized what had changed was not the circumstances, but how I existed inside them. Evan stepped into his new term with a caution he never had before, his decisions slower, less polished, and therefore less celebrated. But whenever we talked, I heard a truer presence in his voice, not someone performing a role, but someone carrying it. Once he said he missed simpler days. I asked which days. He was quiet then, said the days before, having to choose between right and easy. I said that choice would not disappear, he would just get used to living with it. My mother sent me longer messages than before, fewer exclamation points, more questions than declarations. She wrote that she was learning to let things remain unfinished without rushing to patch them up, that she realized for many years she held the family together by covering things rather than facing them. I read and did not reply right away, not because I did not believe her, but because I understood her change did not need my confirmation to exist. My father remained quiet, but in the rare emails he no longer asked for quick answers. He asked to understand. And I answered enough. No more, no less. I did not try to rebuild the relationship, I let it find a new shape on its own. There were days I thought of Houston and no longer felt heavy. The city was like an old map now. I knew the routes, remembered the turns, but I no longer lived inside it. I began writing more. Not to tell this story to others, but to set it down layer by layer. Like clearing a room you have lived in too long. Not throwing everything away. Only keeping what is still usable. In those pages, I no longer called myself the forgotten one. I called myself someone who learned to stand outside and observe, and from that position I saw things I would never have seen from the center. I understood that fairness does not come from everyone treating you the same. It comes from no longer accepting a position that makes you disappear. One late night, Evan called me, his voice tired. He said there were days he wished he had never opened that envelope. I asked why. He said because it made everything harder. I said, yes, but it also made everything real. He was quiet, then asked if I still thought that. I said I did because I had lived inside the unreal for too long. He laughed softly and said he was learning. After the call, I sat in silence for a long time. Not sad, not light, just feeling a clear acceptance that no one in this family became a villain. They were simply people used to one way of existing and forced to learn another when the old way no longer held. I learned too. Learned not to return to old roles when called. Learned not to step into empty spaces just to fill them for others. Learned that silence does not have to mean disappearance. Once I opened the notebook Irene gave me, the early pages yellowed, my handwriting young and rushed. I reread them and realized she gave me the most valuable thing. Not files, not evidence, but the belief that I had the right to record the world in my own way. I closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer, not to store it away, but to know I did not need to carry it everywhere anymore. One weekend morning, with sunlight filling the room, I stood in front of the mirror and realized I was no longer searching for anyone else's reflection in my face. I only saw a woman who had passed through a story without letting it define her entirely. I did not win. I did not lose. I simply stood in the right place. My family is still changing, sometimes forward, sometimes back, but I no longer feel the need to pull them along or chase after them. I understand now that everyone has their own rhythm, and mine is no longer adjusted by other people's silence. When I think back to the moment I placed the envelope on the gift table and walked away, I do not see it as brave or reckless. I see it as the first honest act I ever did for myself. And if there is one thing I am certain of, it is that from that moment on, I no longer live to be seen. I live so I do not abandon myself again. And that, to me, is an ending complete enough to begin another chapter, quieter, but my own. And if you listened all the way to here, maybe somewhere in this story there was a moment that touched you. A time you felt shifted out of your familiar place, stayed silent to keep the peace, wondered whether you were disappearing inside your own family. If you want, leave a comment. It does not have to be long. One line is enough to say you were here, you listened, and you have felt that way. If this story made you think, tap like as a signal that slow and honest stories still have a place. And if you want to keep walking with me through stories about family, about boundaries, about things kept silent too long, subscribe so we can meet again on the next journeys, where nothing is perfect, but everything is real.